I'm a ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, and I need to tell you about the cairns before the story disappears like all the others have. The park covers over 400 square miles of wilderness, alpine tundra, glacier-carved valleys, peaks that scrape 13 and 14,000 feet. I've worked here for 6 years. I thought I understood this land. 2 months ago, hikers started reporting stone stacks appearing overnight on trails where we never placed them. Cairns, those small pyramids of rocks used as trail markers. Except these weren't ours. They showed up first on the Longs Peak Trail near the Keyhole route, maybe 6 or 7 scattered along the granite. I figured some eager scout troop got ambitious. Happens every summer. Then dozens appeared. Then hundreds. My supervisor, Dale Hendricks, asked me to map them after guests complained about confusing markers near Chasm Lake. I borrowed a GPS unit from the Estes Park Visitor Center and spent 3 days plotting coordinates. The pattern didn't make sense until I pulled up the aerial view on my laptop at the Beaver Meadows Ranger Station. The cairn spelled out a number, 47. They stretched across a 2-mile section of alpine tundra, each stack positioned with precision I couldn't explain. Some sat on exposed ridge lines accessible only by technical climbing. Others perched on boulders that would require scaffolding to reach. All of them had appeared between sunset and sunrise. The following week, the configuration changed. Same number of cairns, same general area, but the formation now read 46. I brought this to Dale. He laughed, told me the altitude was getting to me, and suggested I take a few days in Estes Park to clear my head. But I saw his hands trembling when he turned back to his paperwork. Yesterday, I hiked a flat-top mountain. The sunrise painted the Continental Divide in shades of copper and rust, and for a moment, I forgot why I'd come. Then I saw it. A single massive cairn dominated the summit, easily 8 feet tall, constructed from boulders that would require machinery to lift. The structure hadn't existed 48 hours prior. I'd crossed that same ground during my patrol, and there had been nothing but bare rock and tundra grass. The top stone was flat, polished smooth by something other than weather. Words had been carved into its surface, each letter deep and precise. Tyler Webb, Park Ranger. When the cairns reach 0, we show ourselves. We've been building toward this moment since 1847. 47 rangers have tried to stop us. All failed. You're the 47th. Tomorrow, the count reaches 0. Tomorrow, we emerge. And tomorrow, you join the cairns. I stepped back and nearly fell. Stone figures surrounded me on every side, dozens of them, human-shaped, arms at their sides, faces featureless but somehow watching. 46 statues arranged in a perfect circle, and directly in front of me, the 47th figure was still taking shape. Rocks lifted from the ground on their own, stacking themselves into legs, a torso, shoulders. The head formed last, and when I saw its profile against the morning sky, it looked exactly like me. I ran down that mountain faster than any safety protocol would allow. The North Inlet Trail blurred beneath my boots as I half-jogged, half-stumbled toward the trailhead. My radio bounced against my hip, useless. I'd tried calling Dale 3 times, but static swallowed every transmission. The park's communication blackout zones were well documented, but I'd never experienced interference this complete. Every frequency returned nothing but a low hum, almost rhythmic, like stones grinding together. By the time I reached the parking area near Grand Lake, my lungs burned, and my uniform was soaked through with sweat. A family loading camping gear into their Subaru stared as I burst from the tree line. The father pulled his daughter closer. I must have looked deranged, wild-eyed, gasping, covered in dust from scrambling over talus fields. I didn't stop to explain. I jumped into my truck and tore down Trail Ridge Road toward the Kawunich Visitor Center. The afternoon light had turned golden, and normally I'd slow down to watch the elk grazing in the meadows near Holsworth Historic Site. Not today. Today, the shadows between the lodgepole pines seemed to shift and stack, forming shapes that dissolved when I looked directly at them. The visitor center was closing when I arrived. Becky Tanner, one of our interpretive rangers, was locking the front entrance. "Tyler, you look like you saw a ghost." "The archives," I said. "The old ranger logs. Where do we keep them?" She frowned. "Storage building out back, past the lot. But those haven't been touched in years. Some of them date back to the park's founding in 1915. Why?" "I need to see anything from 1847. The park didn't exist in 1847. "I know, but rangers did. Forest Service, cavalry scouts, whoever documented this area before it became federal land. There has to be something." Becky studied my face for a long moment, then handed me a set of keys. "Building C. The filing cabinet's against the north wall. Just lock up when you're done, okay? And Tyler, whatever's going on, you can talk to me." I thanked her and crossed the gravel lot to the storage building. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and old paper. Cardboard boxes lined metal shelves labeled with dates and categories. Wildlife reports, 1952 to 1960. Trail maintenance, 1978. Incident documentation, 1990 to present. I found what I was looking for in a wooden crate marked Pre-Park Territory Records. The documents inside were fragile, their edges brown and crumbling from age and moisture. Letters from military surveyors, sketches of mountain passes, and buried near the bottom, a leather journal held together with twine. The cover bore a name stamped in faded gold: J. Whitfield, U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers, 1847. I opened it carefully. The first 30 pages contained standard expedition notes: distances traveled, elevation changes, weather observations. But on page 31, the handwriting changed. The letters grew jagged, pressed hard into the paper. October 14th, 1847. The Arapaho guide refused to continue past the stone markers. He spoke of boundaries that should not be crossed, of land that remembers those who violate its edges. Lieutenant Carver dismissed this as superstition. He ordered the cairns dismantled so our survey could proceed. That night, Carver did not return to camp. We found his boots beside a new cairn that had not existed at sunset. The stones were still warm. I turned the page. October 17th, 1847. 3 more men missing. 3 more cairns. The remaining soldiers have developed a protocol based on the guide's warnings. I am recording these rules in the event that future parties encounter similar circumstances. First, never dismantle a cairn you did not build. Second, if stones begin to move on their own, do not observe them directly. Look away until the sound of grinding stops. Third, the boundary markers form a perimeter around sacred ground. Do not cross into any area enclosed by cairns after sunset. Fourth, if you see a stone figure that resembles a person you know, do not approach it. Do not speak to it. Leave the area before it finishes forming. Fifth, should the cairns begin counting, you have until 0 to make restitution. The land will accept an offering of genuine respect. It will not accept violence, trickery, or ignorance. The journal entries stopped after October 20th. The final page contained only a single sentence. The count reached 0. God help us all. I sat alone in that storage building as the last sunlight disappeared behind the peaks, and darkness crept through the single dusty window. The rules were real. They'd been real for nearly 200 years, and according to my calculations, the cairns outside would reach 0 by tomorrow morning. I had less than 12 hours to figure out what restitution truly meant before I became the 47th stone figure on that mountain. I drove through the night toward Estes Park, the journal riding shotgun beside me. The road from Kawanichi wound through darkness so complete that my headlights seemed to carve tunnels through solid black. No moon tonight, no stars visible through the cloud cover, just the white lines disappearing beneath my hood and the occasional glint of elk eyes reflecting from the meadows along the roadside. The silence felt heavy, pressing against my windows like something waiting to get in. My phone showed 3 missed calls from Dale. I didn't call back. Whatever conversation awaited me at headquarters could wait until I understood what I was dealing with. The Estes Park Public Library didn't open until 9 in the morning, but I knew the night security guard, Frank Osborne, a retired teacher who'd moved here from Denver after his wife passed. He let me in through the back entrance after I explained it was urgent research for a park emergency. "You look terrible," Frank said, handing me a cup of coffee from his thermos. "When's the last time you slept?" "I'll sleep when this is over." He didn't ask what "this" meant. Frank had lived in these mountains long enough to know that some questions invited answers you didn't want to hear. He simply nodded and returned to a security desk. The library's local history section occupied a small room on the second floor, cramped between genealogy records and old newspapers. I started with everything I could find on the 1847 survey expedition. The official Army records mentioned J. Whitfield's team as lost to harsh weather conditions during an October expedition. No bodies recovered, no further details. But the Estes Park Trail Gazette had run a series of articles in 1978 about unexplained disappearances in the park. One piece mentioned a theory from a northern Arapaho historian named Dr. Samuel Red Cloud, who'd spent years documenting oral traditions about the land before it became a national park. According to Dr. Red Cloud, the Arapaho and Ute peoples had long recognized certain areas of the mountains as sacred ground, places where the boundary between the living world and something older grew thin. They marked these boundaries with stone cairns, not as trail markers but as warnings. The cairn said, "This far and no further." The article quoted Dr. Red Cloud directly. "The stones remember. Every violation, every trespass, every act of disrespect, the land keeps count. And when the count grows too heavy, the land collects what it's owed." I copied down his name carefully and the university where he taught, Fort Lewis College in Durango. A quick search on my phone showed he'd passed away in 2003, but his daughter, Dr. Mary Red Cloud, now worked with the Southern Ute Indian Tribe's Cultural Preservation Department in Ignacio. It was 4 in the morning. I couldn't call her yet. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. Through the window, I could see the outline of Long's Peak against the marginally lighter sky. And something else. A shape on the library's back lawn. I stood slowly and moved toward the glass. The shape resolved into a stack of stones. A cairn, maybe 3 feet tall, positioned directly beneath the window where I sat. It hadn't been there when I arrived. I was certain of that. As I watched, a rock lifted from the grass beside it. The stone rose 6 inches, then a foot, hovering in the air with no visible support. It drifted sideways and settled onto the top of the cairn with a soft click. Then, another rock lifted, and another. Rule 2. If stones begin to move on their own, do not observe them directly. I turned away from the window so fast I knocked over my chair. The crash echoed through the empty library. Behind me, I heard the grinding continue. Stone against stone, click after click, building something I refused to see. I grabbed the journal and my notes and ran for the stairs. Frank called after me, but I didn't stop. I burst through the back door into the cold mountain air and sprinted from my truck without looking at the lawn. The grinding sound followed me. It came from everywhere now, from the decorative rock borders around the parking lot, from the stone facade of the building across the street, from somewhere deep beneath the asphalt itself. Pebbles skittered across the pavement, rolling towards central points, gathering into piles. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, picked them up with fingers that wouldn't cooperate. When I finally got the door open and threw myself inside, I made the mistake of glancing in my rearview mirror. The lawn behind the library was covered with cairns, dozens of them, ranging from knee height to taller than a man. They hadn't been there 60 seconds ago, and in the center of them all stood a figure made of stacked stones, roughly human in shape, facing my direction. Its head tilted, stones scraped against each other, adjusting, and the head tilted further. A gesture of recognition, maybe, or curiosity. The angle was wrong, like a bird examining something it intended to eat. I floored the accelerator and didn't look back again. The drive to my cabin took 20 minutes at normal legal speeds. I made it in 8. By the time I pulled into my gravel driveway near the Big Thompson River, my hands had stopped shaking enough to hold my phone steady. I searched for the Southern Ute Cultural Preservation Department and found the main office number. They wouldn't open for hours, but the website listed an emergency contact for time-sensitive cultural consultation requests. I dialed the number and listened to it ring. A woman answered on the 4th ring, her voice still thick with sleep. "Cultural preservation? This is Mary Red Cloud." "Dr. Red Cloud, my name is Tyler Webb. I'm a ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park, and I hate to talk to you about the stone cairns, the ones your father researched, the ones that count." Silence stretched across the line. When she spoke again, the sleepiness was gone. "Where are you right now, Ranger Webb?" "My cabin, near Drake." "Are you inside?" "Yes." "Good. Lock your doors. Don't look out your windows until sunrise. And whatever you do, don't step onto bare earth until we've spoken face to face." She paused. "You said the cairns are counting. What number are they at?" I thought of the formation I'd mapped 2 days ago, the configuration that had shifted from 47 to 46 to whatever it showed now. I think they hit single digits yesterday, maybe lower. "Then I'm leaving Ignacio in 10 minutes. I'll be there by noon. Don't move until then, Ranger Webb. Don't open your door for anyone. And if you hear stones grinding outside your cabin..." "I know. Don't watch." "No." Her voice carried an edge that cut through my exhaustion. "If you hear grinding at your cabin, it means you've already run out of time. It means the land has decided you're the offering, whether you intended to be or not." The line went dead. Outside my window, in the darkness before dawn, I heard the first soft click of stone settling against stone. The hours before dawn stretched like taffy pulled too thin. I sat in the center of my cabin, away from the windows, away from the walls. The wood floor creaked beneath me as I shifted my weight, and every creak made me flinch. Outside, the grinding continued, sometimes close enough to rattle the dishes in my cabinet, sometimes distant and almost rhythmic, but always present. Stones finding each other in the darkness, building something I couldn't see and didn't want to imagine. My cabin wasn't much. 2 rooms plus a bathroom, built in the 1970s by a family from Fort Collins who'd wanted the weekend retreat near the park. I'd rented it for 3 years now, drawn by the isolation and the sound of the Big Thompson rushing past my back porch. Tonight that isolation felt less like peace and more like a carefully constructed trap. I read Woodfield's journal 3 more times. The entries grew increasingly frantic after October 17th. He described soldiers refusing to sleep, standing back to back through the night, watching the darkness for movement. He wrote about one private who swore he saw his dead mother walking among the cairns, calling his name. The private had run toward her. They found his boots the next morning. Nothing else. Rule 4. If you see a stone figure that resembles someone you know, do not approach it. Do not speak to it. The grinding outside grew louder around 5 in the morning. I pressed my palms against my ears and recited the rules in my head, over and over, like a prayer I didn't quite believe in. The sound seemed to come from directly beneath the cabin now, vibrating through the floorboards, making my teeth ache. Then, abruptly, it stopped. Silence flooded the space where the grinding had been. I lowered my hands and listened. Nothing. Not even the river, which should have been audible through the thin walls. The absence of sound felt heavier than the noise had been. I didn't move until sunlight began seeping through the curtains. When I finally stood and approached the window, my legs trembled from sitting so long in one position. I pulled back the fabric slowly, expecting to see my yard transformed into a garden of stone figures. The grass was empty. No cairns, no stones out of place. The river glinted in the early light, flowing as it always had. A pair of magpies hopped across my gravel driveway, pecking at something I couldn't identify. For a moment, standing there in the thin morning light, I wondered if I'd imagined everything. The stress of the job, the isolation, the altitude. People had lost their grip on reality for less. Maybe I needed a vacation. Maybe I needed a therapist. Maybe I needed to quit this job and move somewhere flat and boring, where rocks stayed where you put them. Then I looked at the wooden porch railing. Deep gouges marked the surface, scratches that hadn't existed yesterday, forming patterns that almost looked like letters. I couldn't read them. Part of me didn't want to. I waited inside until I heard tires on gravel at 11:47 in the morning. The woman who stepped out of the dusty pickup truck looked to be in her early 60s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical braid. She wore jeans, hiking boots, and a faded denim jacket with beadwork on the shoulders. Her face was weathered but alert, her eyes scanning my property before settling on me in the doorway. "Ranger Webb." It wasn't a question. "Dr. Red Cloud, thank you for coming." She walked purposefully toward my porch, pausing at the bottom step to examine the scratched railing. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her shoulders tighten. "You said you mapped the cairn formations. Show me." We spread my GPS data across the kitchen table. Mary studied the coordinates, the patterns, the countdown sequence. She asked questions about specific locations, whether certain cairns appeared near water sources, whether any formed circles rather than lines, whether I'd noticed variations in the size of stones used. "The large structures use older rock," I said. "Granite that looks weathered, like it's been sitting on the surface for centuries. The smaller cairns are newer stone, stuff that could have been excavated recently." Mary nodded slowly. "The old stones are the original markers, placed by my ancestors, Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne, generations before any Europeans set foot here. They mark the boundaries of sacred ground, places where ceremonies were held, places where the barrier between our world and the spirit world grows thin." "And the new stones?" "Responses, reactions, the land expressing its anger." She looked up from the map. "Every time someone crosses a boundary, disturbs a marker, builds a trail through protected ground, the land remembers. It adds to the count. And when the count grows too heavy, it collects what it's owed. The 46 ranges before me, they were collected. Some were rangers, some were surveyors like the men in that journal. Some were prospectors, settlers, soldiers, anyone who violated the sacred boundaries and refused to make it right. Mary traced a finger along the formation I'd mapped. "The countdown isn't about punishment, Ranger Webb. It's about patience running out. The land has been waiting for someone to understand, for someone to listen instead of just survive. How do I make it right? The journal mentioned restitution, genuine respect. What does that mean? Mary was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun and the kitchen dimmed. My father spent 30 years trying to answer that question. He believed the violations weren't just physical, they were spiritual. Every trail carved through sacred ground, every cairn knocked over by careless hikers, every ceremony site turned into a tourist attraction. The land doesn't want blood. It wants acknowledgement. It wants the boundaries restored. But how? The Park Service has been building trails for over a century. We can't just close the entire mountain. Not the entire mountain, just the places that were marked. Mary pulled a worn map from her jacket pocket and unfolded it beside my GPS data. The paper was hand-drawn, covered in symbols I didn't recognize. My father documented the original boundary markers before most of them were destroyed. The sacred perimeter runs from Long's Peak to Flat Top Mountain, down through Wild Basin, and across to the headwaters of the Big Thompson. Everything inside that line was protected ground. I stared at the map. The area she'd outlined covered some of the most popular hiking destinations in the park: Bear Lake, Sky Pond, the Keyhole Route. Thousands of visitors cross that boundary every day. The countdown is at 0, Mary continued, or close to it. The land has decided that you, specifically, are the 47th offering. But that doesn't mean you have to accept that role. What's the alternative? She folded her map and met my eyes. We go to the boundary stones, the original ones, the oldest markers that still stand, and you make an offering of genuine respect. You speak to the land directly and ask for a different path forward. That's it? I just talk to some rocks? Mary's expression hardened. Those rocks have been listening for 10,000 years. They've heard every promise broken by every government, every company, every well-meaning conservationist who thought they knew better than the people who lived here first. Talking to them isn't simple. It requires you to mean what you say. And if you don't, if there's any lie in your heart, any intention to go back to business as usual, the stones won't know. She stood and walked toward the door. Pack water in warm layers. The boundary stone we need is near the Continental Divide, above tree line. It's a 6-hour hike from the nearest trailhead, and we need to reach it before dark. Why before dark? Mary paused with her hand on the door frame. Because after sunset, you won't be the only one walking those trails. And the others don't take kindly to visitors who haven't learned the rules. She stepped outside, and I heard her boots crunching on gravel as she walked toward her truck to retrieve her own gear. I looked at the map still spread across my table. The sacred boundary, the protected ground. 177 years of violations stacking up like stones. And now, the count had reached 0. We started from the Bear Lake trailhead at 1:30 in the afternoon. The parking lot was full of families and day hikers heading toward Nymph Lake or the Alberta Falls overlook. Kids in bright jackets chased each other across the pavement, while parents juggled water bottles and trail maps. A group of college students posed for photographs with Hallett Peak behind them. A normal summer day in the park. Nobody looked at Mary and me twice as we shouldered our packs and headed toward the Flat Top Mountain Trail. The first mile passed without incident. Aspens gave way to subalpine fir as we climbed, and the chatter of tourists faded behind us. Mary set a steady pace, her hiking boots finding purchase on the rocky path with the ease of someone who'd walked these mountains her entire life. She moved like the terrain was an old friend she was visiting. You said 46 rangers tried to stop this before me? I said, slightly winded from the altitude. What did they do wrong? They tried to stop it. That was the problem. Mary ducked beneath a low-hanging branch. Every one of them approached the situation as something to be defeated, a threat to be neutralized. They didn't understand that the land isn't attacking, it's defending. There's a difference. Defending against what? Against forgetting. Against erasure. She paused at a switchback and turned to face me. Below us, Bear Lake glittered like a dropped coin. When my people lived here, we didn't own this land. We belonged to it. We knew which places were sacred and which were safe for everyday use. We maintained the boundaries because we understood that some things aren't meant to be crossed. And then we showed up. And then you showed up. With your surveys and your claims and your recreational areas, you drew new lines on maps and ignored the ones that had been here for millennia. Mary resumed walking. The land tried to warn you. The cairns were always warnings. But your people saw them as obstacles or curiosities, things to be documented and dismantled. We climbed in silence for another hour. The tree line fell away, replaced by tundra grass and exposed granite. The air thinned noticeably, and I found myself stopping more frequently to catch my breath. Mary waited each time. Around 4 o'clock, we crested a ridge, and I saw them. Cairns. Hundreds of them, scattered across the alpine meadow ahead. They varied in size from ankle-height stacks to towering columns that must have weighed tons. The formations stretched toward the Continental Divide, marking a path that no official trail had ever followed. "We're inside the boundary now," Mary said quietly. "Whatever you see from this point forward, remember the rules. Don't touch the stones. Don't speak to anything that speaks to you first. And don't run, no matter what." "What if something chases me?" "Nothing will chase you. They don't need to. Inside the boundary, the land decides who leaves and who stays. Running just tells it you don't belong here." We walked among the cairns as the afternoon shadows lengthened. The stones seemed to watch us pass. An absurd thought, but I couldn't shake it. Some of the larger formations had shapes that suggested shoulders, necks, the curve of a bowed head. Others stood at angles that defied balance, leaning in directions that should have toppled them. I kept my eyes forward and tried not to look too closely. The grinding started around 5. It began as a low vibration beneath my boots, barely perceptible. Then the sound reached my ears. Stone sliding against stone somewhere behind us. I didn't turn around, neither did Mary. "Keep walking," she said. "Steady pace, don't change your rhythm." The grinding grew louder, closer. I heard individual rocks shifting, settling in the new positions. The sound of construction happening in my peripheral vision, just outside the range of direct sight. Something scraped across the ground to my left. A shadow moved at the edge of my awareness. Tall, roughly human-shaped, keeping pace with us about 30 feet away. I fixed my gaze on Mary's braids swinging between her shoulder blades and refused to look. "It's watching you," Mary said, her voice steady. "Deciding if you're a threat or an offering. Don't give it a reason to choose." "How do I do that?" "By being neither. You're not here to fight. You're not here to surrender. You're here to talk. Hold that intention in your mind and don't let it waver." The shadow drew closer. I could hear footsteps now, heavy, grinding footsteps that sounded like boulders being dragged across bedrock. The thing was 15 feet away, 10. Close enough that I could see the outline of it in my peripheral vision. A figure made of stacked stones, joints grinding as it moved, head swiveling to track us. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something other than walk calmly through this nightmare landscape. but I held the intention Mary had described. I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to surrender. I'm here to talk. The stone figure stopped. I heard it settle into stillness behind us, rocks clicking into place like vertebrae realigning. The grinding faded. When I finally risked a glance backward, the figure had become just another can, indistinguishable from the hundreds of others dotting the meadow. Mary exhaled slowly. Good. It accepted your intention. For now. For now? The land is watching. It will keep watching until you prove what you came here to prove. One test doesn't mean you've passed. We reached the base of a rocky outcropping as the sun touched the western peaks. The light turned everything gold and amber, painting the tundra in colors that belonged on postcards. Under different circumstances, I might have stopped to take a photograph. Mary pointed toward a narrow gap in the rocks ahead. Through there. The boundary stone is on the other side. The gap was barely wide enough for one person to pass. The walls rose 20 feet on either side, rough granite streaked with lichen and mineral deposits. As I approached, I noticed markings carved into the stone, symbols I didn't recognize, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. What did the markings mean? Instructions, warnings, history. Mary gestured for me to go first. This passage is called the Throat. It's the only way to reach the central stone without crossing through restricted ground. My father found it in 1971 after 3 years of searching. I squeezed into the gap. The walls pressed close on both sides, scraping against my pack and catching on the straps. Above me, the strip of visible sky narrowed to a ribbon of fading blue. The temperature dropped sharply as I moved deeper into the passage, the rock radiating a cold that seeped through my jacket and into my bones. My breath fogged in front of me despite the summer warmth I'd left behind seconds ago. Halfway through, I heard breathing. Not my own. Not Mary's behind me. Something else, coming from the stone itself. A slow, rhythmic exhalation that seemed to pulse through the granite. The walls contracted slightly with each breath, pressing closer for a heartbeat before relaxing. The throat was alive, or something inside it was. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other. The breathing followed me, synchronized with my steps, as if the passage itself was aware of my presence and measuring my progress. When I finally emerged on the other side, the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the divide. I stood at the edge of a circular clearing, maybe 50 feet across, ringed by the largest cairns I'd seen yet. Each one towered at least 10 feet tall, composed of stones so perfectly balanced they looked like sculptures rather than random stacks. And in the center of the clearing stood a single massive boulder, its surface covered in carvings that glowed faintly in the dying light. The glow pulsed gently, like a heartbeat. The boundary stone. Mary emerged from the throat behind me, slightly breathless from squeezing through with her pack. She brushed granite dust from her sleeves and looked toward the central boulder with an expression I couldn't read. Reverence, maybe, or fear. "We made it before dark," she said. "Now the real work begins." The last light faded as Mary led me toward the boundary stone. Up close, the boulder was massive, easily 12 feet tall and twice as wide, its surface worn smooth by millennia of wind and weather. The carvings covered every inch of visible rock, spiraling patterns and angular symbols that seemed to shift in the gathering darkness. Some of the grooves still held traces of red pigment, ochre that had somehow survived centuries of exposure to the elements. I could smell something faint and earthy rising from the stone, like wet clay and pine resin mixed together. "The stone has been here longer than my people's memory," Mary said. "Longer than any tribe's memory. The stories say it was placed by the first ones. The people who walked this land when the glaciers still covered the valleys below. They understood something we've forgotten. They knew how to listen. Listen to what? To the land itself. To what it needs. To what it's trying to tell us. She gestured toward the carvings. These aren't decorations. They're a language. A way of communicating with something that doesn't think in words the way we do. I studied the patterns but couldn't find any meaning in them. They looked random to me. Loops and angles and dots arranged without any logic I could recognize. What am I supposed to do? Mary reached into her pack and withdrew a small leather pouch. She opened it and poured the contents into her palm. A handful of dried sage, a few strands of sweetgrass, and a small piece of turquoise the color of a summer sky. These are offerings, not payment. The land doesn't want to be bought. They're gestures of respect, acknowledgement that you're asking for something, not demanding it. She handed me the items. Place them at the base of the stone, then put your hands on the rock and speak. Speak what? Whatever truth is in your heart. The land will know if you're lying. It will know if you're making promises you don't intend to keep. So don't make promises. Just tell it what you understand and what you're willing to do. I knelt at the base of the boulder and arranged the offerings on a flat stone near the carved surface. The sage crumbled slightly under my fingers. The turquoise caught the last faint glow from the western horizon and held it like a tiny ember. Then I placed my palms against the boundary stone. The rock was warm, not sun-warmed, something deeper, as if heat radiated from somewhere far beneath the surface. The warmth spread up through my hands, into my wrists, traveling along my arms toward my chest. It didn't hurt, but it felt invasive, like something was reading me through my skin. I opened my mouth to speak, and the words that came out surprised me. I didn't know. None of us knew. We drew our lines on maps and built our trails and told ourselves we were preserving something beautiful, but we never asked what was already here. We never asked what the land wanted. My voice sounded strange in the clearing, flat, absorbed by the ring of cairns surrounding us. I can't undo what's been done. I can't bring back the people who were taken. But I can listen now. I can try to understand. And I can fight for the boundaries you've been trying to protect. The warmth in my arms intensified. The carvings beneath my palms began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with something I couldn't hear but could feel. A vibration that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the stone, in the earth, in the air itself. Then the voices started. They came from the cairns around us. Not words exactly, but sounds that carried meaning. Whispers of wind through rocks, the grinding of stone against stone, a chorus of something that had been waiting for a very long time. The sounds layered over each other, building into a pressure that made my ears ache and my jaw clench. I felt the vibrations in my chest and the spaces between my ribs, as if something was trying to communicate directly with my bones. I kept my hands on the stone. I didn't pull away. Whatever was happening, I needed to see it through. The voices grew clearer. I began to pick out individual tones within the chorus. Some were angry, sharp, grinding sounds that spoke of violation, theft, and broken promises. Others were sad, low moans that carried the weight of centuries of loss. And underneath them all, a deeper voice, ancient and patient, that seemed to be asking a question. I didn't know how to answer, so I just kept talking. The trails through the sacred ground. I'll work to close them. I don't know if I can do it alone, but I'll find people who will help. Dr. Red Cloud's father documented the boundaries. We can use his maps to show the Park Service which areas need protection. It might take years. It might take decades. But I'll start the process. That's all I can promise. That I'll start. The question and voice grew louder. The other sounds faded around it until only that deep tone remained, resonating through the stone and into my bones. Then it spoke. Not in words, but in images that flooded my mind. I saw the mountains as they had been before any human walked them. Glaciers carving valleys, rivers finding their paths, the slow accumulation of stone and soil and life over millions of years. I saw the first people arriving, small groups who moved carefully through the high country, who learned which places welcomed them and which places asked to be left alone. I saw them building the first cairns, marking boundaries not to claim territory but to remember what the land had taught them. I saw the violations begin. Surveyors with their instruments, miners with their picks, tourists with their cameras. Each incursion small on its own, but accumulating like stones in a pile, building towards something that could no longer be ignored. I saw the 46 figures who had come before me, rangers and soldiers and settlers, each one standing where I stood now, each one making promises. Some had been arrogant, believing they could outsmart the land. Others had been desperate, saying anything to survive another day. And I saw what happened when those promises were broken. The slow transformation, flesh becoming stone, consciousness trapped in mineral form, joining the boundary markers they had sworn to protect. Their faces frozen in expressions of dawning horror as they realized what was happening to them. The images stopped. The deep voice posed its question again, and this time I understood it. Will you become like them, or will you become something different? Something different, I said. I don't want to be another broken promise. I want to be the one who actually does what he says. Silence fell over the clearing. The warmth in my arms faded. The carving stopped glowing. I waited, unsure if I'd said the right thing, unsure if anything I could say would ever be enough. Then Mary spoke from behind me. Look. I turned. The cairns surrounding us had changed. The towering stacks that had ringed the clearing were crumbling, stones falling away from their formations and settling onto the ground. But they weren't just falling randomly. They were arranging themselves into new patterns, lower and flatter, forming a path that led from the boundary stone back toward the throat. And standing along that path, no longer frozen in stone, were figures. People. Dozens of them, dressed in clothing that spanned nearly 2 centuries of fashion and function. A man in the blue uniform of an army surveyor, brass buttons tarnished to green. A woman in the rough canvas of a 19th century prospector, her face weathered and determined even in death. Rangers in uniforms I recognized from old photographs in the visitor center archives, some from as recently as the 1980s. They stood motionless, their faces blank, their eyes reflecting the starlight that was beginning to appear overhead. "The trapped ones," Mary whispered. "The land is releasing them." As I watched, the figures began to fade, not disappearing exactly, but becoming translucent, their forms losing solidity until I could see the stars through their bodies. One by one, they turned toward the boundary stone. One by one, they bowed their heads. Then they were gone. The stones that had formed their shapes lay scattered across the clearing, ordinary rocks now, no longer stacked into anything that resembled a human form. The path they had created remained, leading toward the throat and the world beyond. Mary walked to my side. Her cheeks were wet, though I hadn't seen her cry. "My father searched his whole life for a way to release them. He believed it was possible, but he never found the right words." She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "You did. Somehow, you found them." "I didn't find anything. I just told the truth." "That's exactly what I mean." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. The land doesn't want grand gestures or elaborate rituals. It wants honesty. It wants people who mean what they say. 46 people stood here before you and made promises they couldn't keep or didn't intend to keep. You're the first one who simply told the truth about what you could and couldn't do. I looked at the boundary stone. The carvings had stopped glowing, but they seemed different now, softer somehow, less threatening. The ochre pigment in the grooves caught the starlight and gleamed like old blood turning to rust. "The countdown," I said. "Is it over?" Mary shook her head slowly. "The countdown reached 0 the moment you touched the stone. What happened next was the land's choice. Accept your offering or add you to the collection. It chose to accept." She paused. "But the work isn't finished, Ranger Webb. You made a promise to fight for the boundaries. The land will remember. And if you break that promise..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood clearly. The stones would remember. They always did. We didn't leave the clearing until the stars had fully emerged overhead. Mary insisted on performing a closing ceremony at the boundary stone, burning the sage I'd placed as an offering, speaking words in a language I didn't recognize, her voice carrying across the silent alpine meadow like something that belonged there. The smoke rose in a thin column, undisturbed by any breeze, climbing toward the stars as if delivering a message to something watching from above. I stood back and observed, aware that I was witnessing something my presence might diminish, something that predated my people's arrival on this continent by thousands of years. When she finished, she turned to me with an expression that had softened since we first met. "The land has accepted your offering, but acceptance isn't the same as trust. Trust takes time. It takes proof." "How do I prove myself?" "By doing what you said you'd do. By starting the work, even when it's hard, even when nobody else understands why it matters." She shouldered her pack and adjusted the straps. "We should go. The path won't stay open forever." The walk back through the throat felt different. The walls didn't press as close. The breathing I'd heard before was absent, replaced by ordinary silence. When I emerged on the other side, the alpine meadow lay peaceful under the stars. No cairns visible except the original boundary markers that had stood for millennia. We hiked through the night, following the path of flattened stones that the released figures had created. Mary led with a small flashlight, picking her way across the tundra with the same confident stride she'd shown during daylight. I followed, my legs aching from the altitude and exertion, my mind turning over everything I'd seen and heard. Around 3 a.m, we stopped to rest near a small tarn that reflected the Milky Way like a second sky. The water was perfectly still, holding the stars so clearly that I momentarily lost track of which way was up. Mary passed me a thermos of coffee that had somehow stayed warm in her pack. The heat spread through my chest as I drank, chasing away some of the mountain chill. "The 46 who were trapped," I said. "Did they all make promises they didn't keep? Or were some of them just in the wrong place at the wrong time?" "Both." Mary settled onto a flat rock near the water's edge. "Some were violators who knew exactly what they were doing. Surveyors who dismantled cairns to clear sightlines. Prospectors who dug in sacred ground despite warnings. But others were people like you. Rangers, caretakers, people who wanted to protect the land but didn't understand what that meant. What happened to them? They promised changes they didn't have. The power to make. They swore to close trails, redirect tourists, restore boundaries. But when they got back to their offices and their supervisors and their bureaucracies, they couldn't follow through. The Park Service has its own priorities. Budget concerns, visitor numbers, political pressures. one ranger's promise doesn't count for much against all of that. I thought about Dale Hendricks, my supervisor, laughing off my concerns about the cairn formations. I thought about the park superintendent who I'd met exactly once at an orientation session. I thought about the chain of command that separated a ground-level ranger from anyone with actual decision-making authority. You're saying I'm going to fail too? I'm saying it won't be easy, but you have something the others didn't. Mary gestured back toward the direction we'd come. You have my father's maps. You have documentation of the original boundaries. And you have me. You'll help? The Southern Ute Cultural Preservation Department has been trying to establish sacred site protections in this region for decades. We've had some successes. Bears Ears, Chaco Canyon, places where the political winds shifted in our favor. Rocky Mountain has been harder because the tourism industry here is so entrenched. But with a ranger working from inside the system, someone who can advocate from within the park service. She trailed off, letting me complete the thought. We might actually have a chance. We might. No guarantees. But the land gave you an opportunity that 46 others didn't get. I think that means something. We reached the Bear Lake trailhead just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. My truck sat alone in the parking lot, dew condensing on the windshield. The families and day hikers wouldn't arrive for hours yet. Mary handed me a card with her contact information and a folded copy of her father's boundary map. Call me when you're ready to start. We'll need to document everything. The original markers, the areas that need protection, the trails that cross sacred ground. It's going to be a long process. Years, probably. Maybe longer. I'll call you tomorrow. She smiled. The first genuine smile I'd seen from her since we met. Get some sleep first. You look like you've been awake for 3 days. I drove back to my cabin near Drake as the sun climbed over the peaks. The Big Thompson sparkled in the morning light, running clear and cold over the rocks where it curved past my property. A family of deer grazed in my neighbor's pasture, their ears twitching at the sound of my engine, but otherwise unbothered by my presence. Everything looked normal, peaceful, as if the last 72 hours had been nothing but a fever dream brought on by altitude sickness and too little sleep. But when I parked in my driveway and walked toward my front porch, I saw that the scratches on my railing had changed. The marks that had looked like random gouges now formed clear letters, carved deep into the wood. We will be watching. Not a threat, I realized. A promise. The land would hold me accountable. I slept for 14 hours straight. When I woke, it was past midnight, and my phone showed 17 missed calls from Dale Hendricks and 3 voicemails that grew increasingly irritated in tone. I ignored them and started making notes. The boundary map Mary had given me covered terrain I knew well. Bear Lake, Nymph Lake, Emerald Lake, some of the most popular destinations in the park. The Longs Peak Trail crossed sacred ground at multiple points. The Keyhole Route, which drew thousands of peak baggers every summer, ran directly through what had once been a ceremonial site. Closing these trails would be controversial. The outdoor recreation community would protest. Local businesses that depended on tourism dollars would lobby against any restrictions. The Park Service itself would resist anything that reduced visitor numbers or accessibility. But I made a promise, and the land was watching. I started with research. Federal regulations governing sacred site protections on public lands, precedents from other national parks where similar protections had been established, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, executive orders on tribal consultation, legal frameworks that might support closing or relocating trails through indigenous sacred areas. Each document led to 3 more, and each of those led to a dozen references and citations. By morning, I had a rough outline of a proposal. It would need refinement, supporting documentation, and allies within the system willing to champion it. But it was a start. I called Dale at 8 o'clock. "Webb, where the hell have you been? You've missed 2 shifts, you're not answering your radio, and the superintendent is asking questions about unauthorized research into park archives. I need to meet with you. Today. It's about the cairns." Silence on the line. Then, "The cairns that you were mapping? The ones you said were forming numbers?" They stopped counting. But there's something bigger going on, Dale. Something the Park Service needs to address. I have documentation, historical records, boundary maps, evidence of sacred sites that our trails are violating. More silence. I could hear Dale breathing, processing. "You know how this sounds, right? You're talking about sacred sites and violations. The superintendent is going to think you've lost your mind." "Maybe, but I have to try. If you're not willing to hear me out, I'll go over your head. I'll contact the regional director, tribal authorities, whoever will listen. This is too important to ignore because it sounds crazy." Dale sighed heavily. "Fine. Come to the Beaver Meadows station at noon. Bring whatever documentation you have. But Webb, if this turns out to be nothing, if you're wasting my time with some kind of spiritual awakening or mountain madness, your career here is over. You understand that?" "I understand." I hung up and looked out my window at the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks catching the morning light and glowing pink and gold. Somewhere up there, the boundary stone sat in its clearing, waiting to see if I'd keep my word. Somewhere up there, 46 consciousnesses had been trapped for decades or centuries because they couldn't follow through on promises they'd made in moments of desperation. I wasn't going to be the 47th. I refused to become another cautionary tale carved into stone. I gathered my notes, Mary's map, and copies of the documents I'd found in the archive. I put on a clean uniform and made sure my badge was visible. Then I drove toward Beaver Meadows, rehearsing what I would say, knowing that the hardest part of any journey is convincing others to walk the path with you. The land had given me a chance. Now it was time to prove I truly deserved it. The Beaver Meadows Ranger Station smelled like old coffee and bureaucratic stagnation. I'd worked out of this building for 6 years, passed through these doors thousands of times without a second thought. But walking through them that afternoon felt like entering foreign territory. The familiar hallway seemed longer than usual, the photographs of past superintendents on the walls watching my approach with something like judgment. Dale waited in the conference room, seated at the head of a table covered in maps and incident reports. He didn't stand when I entered. He didn't smile. "Close the door." I did. The click of the latch sounded louder than it should have in the quiet building. Dale studied me for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. He'd been a ranger for over 30 years, had worked his way up from seasonal trail maintenance to district supervisor through dedication and political savvy. I'd always respected him, even when we disagreed on policy or procedure. But the way he looked at me now carried something I hadn't seen before. Wariness, maybe, or disappointment at what I'd apparently become. "Before you start," he said, "I want you to understand something. I've covered for you these past few days, told the superintendent you were dealing with a family emergency. But that excuse has an expiration date, and we're approaching it fast." "I appreciate that, Dale, but what I'm about to show you is more important than my job." "Nothing is more important than your job when your job is the only thing keeping you from being fired for cause." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit. Show me what you've got." I spread Mary's father's map across the table first. The hand-drawn boundaries, the symbols marking sacred sites, the careful documentation of a lifetime of research. This was created by Dr. Samuel Redcloud, a northern Arapaho historian who spent 30 years studying this region. It shows the original sacred boundaries as understood by the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples who lived here before European contact. Dale leaned forward, examining the map with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades reading terrain. And these boundaries intersect with our current trail system. They don't just intersect. Our most popular trails run directly through areas that were designated as sacred ground for thousands of years. Bear Lake, the Longs Peak Corridor, the Keyhole Route, Flat Top Mountain. Webb, if you're suggesting we close half the park's major attractions because of some historical document, I'm not suggesting we close anything immediately. I'm suggesting we start a formal consultation process with tribal authorities, document the sites properly, develop alternative trails that avoid the most sensitive areas. It's been done before. I pulled out the research I'd compiled overnight. Bears Ears, Chaco Canyon, Yellowstone's thermal features. There are precedents for rerouting recreational access to protect indigenous sacred sites. Dale flipped through the documents, his frown deepening with each page. This would take years, decades maybe. Environmental impact assessments, public comment periods, congressional involvement if we're talking about significant trail closures. I know. That's why we need to start now. And the cairns? The ones you were mapping, the ones you said were counting down. His voice carried a note of skepticism that bordered on mockery. What happened to those? I hesitated. This was the part I've been dreading. The supernatural elements of the past few days didn't translate well into bureaucratic language, but I promised myself I would tell the truth, even when it sounded insane. They stopped counting. The situation resolved itself, but the underlying issue remains. The land has been sending warnings for nearly 200 years, and we've been ignoring them. Dale set down the documents and rubbed his temples. Listen to yourself. The land has been sending warnings. Do you understand how that sounds? I understand exactly how it sounds. I also understand that 46 people have disappeared in this park since 1847, and we've never found explanations for any of them. I've seen the old incident reports, Dale, the ones locked in the archive storage. Rangers who went out on patrol and never came back, surveyors whose camps were found abandoned, hikers who vanished without a trace in areas where there's nowhere to hide. Something shifted in Dale's expression. The skepticism remained, but underneath it I glimpsed recognition. A flicker of something he'd been keeping buried, maybe for years. He knew what I was talking about. He'd seen those files too. Perhaps he'd even had experiences of his own that he'd never shared with anyone. Even if everything you're saying is true, he said slowly, carefully, even if there's something out there that we can't explain, how does closing trails solve the problem? If this land is as dangerous as you're suggesting, shouldn't we be warning people away entirely? The land isn't dangerous to everyone. It's dangerous to people who violate specific boundaries, people who ignore the markers, who dismiss the warnings, who treat sacred ground like just another hiking destination. I tapped Mary's map. If we respect the boundaries, the danger disappears. That's what the original inhabitants understood. That's what we need to learn. Dale was quiet for a long time. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of a tour bus pulling into the visitor center parking lot. Families unloading, children laughing. Another ordinary day in a park that hid extraordinary secrets. I can't take this to the superintendent, Dale finally said. His voice had lost some of its edge, replaced by something that sounded almost like resignation. Not like this. Not with talk of warnings from the land and disappearances going back to the 1840s. She'll think I've lost my mind, and she'll fire both of us before the week is out. My heart sank. So that's it? You're not willing to... I said I can't take it to her like this. He held up a hand. But there might be another way. We have a formal tribal consultation process that's been dormant for years. Budget cuts, staffing shortages, the usual excuses. If someone were to propose reviving that process, framing it as a cultural preservation initiative rather than a supernatural threat response, it might get traction. You're saying hide the real reason behind bureaucratic language. I'm saying speak the language that gets results. You've got documentation from a legitimate academic source. You've got support from the Southern Ute Cultural Preservation Department. You've got precedents from other parks. Frame this as a proactive partnership with indigenous communities, and you might actually get somewhere.